Back at the end of the 19th century, the concept of expansion to the east, Drang nach Osten, emerged in the nationalist circles of the German Empire. Under its influence, another imperial concept appeared, Lebensraum in Osten, meaning living space in the east, which envisioned German colonization of Eastern Europe. After Hitler came to power, Lebensraum in Osten merged with Nazi racial policy. In this episode of WAS, we will explore what plans Hitler had for Ukraine and which of his ideas came to fruition. We will also discuss which Soviet know-how the Nazis used, whether the occupation became a time of cultural revival, and what chances there were for the restoration of Ukrainian statehood. At the beginning of 1941, Hitler tasked the chief ideologue of the Nazi Party, Alfred Rosenberg, with developing a plan to manage the eastern territories slated for occupation. Rosenberg created a 10-year plan and proposed the idea that Germany should rely on two allies, Finland in the north and Ukraine in the south, for which he suggested creating a Ukrainian state. This state was also to include Russian ethnic lands, integrating the Russian community to make the entity easier to govern. In April, Hitler approved this concept. Parallel to the plan to capture the USSR, known as Barbarossa, an economic plan for the conquered territories was being developed. This was overseen by Hermann Göring, Hitler's right-hand man. The General Plan Ost envisioned classic colonization. Ukraine was to be turned into a raw material appendage, and the population was to be displaced and partially eliminated. Approximately a quarter of Ukraine's inhabitants were planned to be assimilated, meaning Germanized. Tens of millions of people were to be destroyed through artificial famine or ethnic cleansing. On Ukrainian lands, the Germans wanted to create comfortable cities where the service would be provided by Slavic slaves. A separate plan of the Germans concerned central and southern Ukraine, including the Crimean Peninsula. These lands were to become Gottengau, or the Gothic District, a military outpost of the Nazis on the eastern border of Europe. Thus, in June 1941, Hitler had two concepts on the table: the creation of a puppet Ukrainian state and its opposite, harsh colonization. Which one prevailed? Let's try to address this not-so-obvious question. From the very beginning of the war on the Eastern Front, the German advance into Ukrainian territory stalled due to the significant concentration of Soviet troops near the borders. In Ukraine, the Germans managed to inflict significant losses on the USSR and achieve several operational successes. However, overall, the Barbarossa operation lagged behind the plan. The Battle of Moscow at the end of 1941 and the subsequent winter counteroffensive by the Red Army halted the Wehrmacht's advance, ultimately turning the planned blitzkrieg into a prolonged war. Hoping that the Germans would act roughly according to Rosenberg's plan, on June 30th, 1941, Ukrainian nationalists in Lviv proclaimed the act of restoration of the Ukrainian state. The Nazis did not support the action and arrested the organizers, OUN leaders Stepan Bandera and Yaroslav Stetsko. Ukrainian affairs in the Reich government were then managed by Hans Koch. He was born in Lviv, spent half his life in Galicia, and even participated in the Ukrainian Revolution in the ranks of the Ukrainian Galician army. According to Yaroslav Stetsko, when Hans Koch learned about the act of restoration of the Ukrainian state, his reaction was unequivocal. The German state currently has no plans to tolerate any state structures on territory won by the blood of its soldiers, and the best path for the Ukrainian nation is to assist the Germans in their struggle through labor. From then on, Ukrainian nationalists lost illusions about German loyalty to Ukrainian statehood and soon began active resistance against the Third Reich. After their arrest, Bandera and Stetsko were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where they remained until 1944. They were released only when the Germans decided to use them in the fight against the Soviet Union, but the OUN leaders refused to support the Nazis. At the end of the summer of 1941, the Germans established the Reichskommissariat Ukraine on the occupied Ukrainian lands. The residence of the Reichskommissar was located in Rivne, which became the center of Ukraine's occupation. The Reichskommissariat Ukraine was headed by the harsh figure also named Koch, but Erich. He had a reputation as a successful administrator who developed the agricultural sector in East Prussia, which aligned with the perception of Ukraine as an agrarian region. The Reichskommissariat Ukraine also included some border territories of Belarus and Poland. At the same time, in western Ukraine, the Nazis and their allies created the Galicia district, the Bukovina and Transcarpathia governorates, and Bessarabia in the south. In August 1941, Adolf Hitler emphasized that the raw materials and agriculture of Ukraine are vital for the future conduct of the war. However, the Germans failed to create an effective extractive industry. The Soviet Union had evacuated or destroyed most of the equipment. As a result, the occupiers restored only 3% of Ukraine's industrial capacity. Contrary to their own anti-communist ideology, the Nazis decided not to dismantle the collective farms, but transformed them into community farms, or civic enterprises. In 1942, Ukraine provided 80% of the Wehrmacht's meat needs and 74% of its fats. At the beginning of 1942, Nazi ideologues, led by the same Rosenberg, formulated the principles of education in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. A 7-year school became mandatory. The first 4 grades were for primary education, and the next 3 for vocational training. Secondary education was to be provided by 3-year technical schools teaching agriculture, forestry, technical trades, commerce, and even administration, as the Nazis lacked their own personnel to administer such a vast territory. Some universities in Lviv, Kyiv, Dnipropetrovsk, and Kharkiv continued to operate. However, Hitler soon ordered a change in approach. Under no circumstances should the local population be given higher education. If we make this mistake, we ourselves will foster future resistance against us. Therefore, in the Führer's opinion, it is entirely sufficient to teach the local population, including the so-called Ukrainians, only reading and writing. Although German was the official language in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, Ukrainian was used in administration, and newspapers and magazines were published in it. Many cultural figures, such as Olena Teliha, Ivan Irliavsky, and Ivan Rohach, were executed for their active pro-Ukrainian stance. At the same time, other artists were actively working. Sculptor, film director, and playwright Ivan Kavaleridze, the author of monuments to Grand Princess Olga and Grand Prince Yaroslav, headed the culture department in Kyiv. Scholar Yuri Shevelov worked at the university, writing articles and poems in Kharkiv and later in Lviv. Geographer and encyclopedist Volodymyr Kubiovich led the Ukrainian Central Committee in Krakow, defending Ukrainian interests in the general governorate. Writer Ivan Bariani, who was in the Ukrainian underground in occupied Galicia, wrote his novel Tiger Hunters in 1944. Many theaters and cinemas resumed operations with audiences, including not only Germans, but also Ukrainians, watching performances, including those based on Ukrainian plays. Cinemas mostly became centers of propaganda. The occupying authorities set low ticket prices, so attendance was high. They showed German newsreels translated into Ukrainian, as well as propaganda and anti-Semitic films. Museums also operated, but before the retreat, they were looted. According to Ukrainian historian Vitaly Hedz, the Nazis removed 40,000 various exhibits from Kyiv alone. The period of relative liberalism in cultural life ended in 1942. The rise of Ukrainian national consciousness displeased the Germans. Ideological control and repressions intensified. Strict censorship of printed publications was introduced, and the Kyiv Opera was closed. From the beginning of the winter of 1941, the Nazis faced a severe labor shortage. It was decided to employ the population of the occupied territories. In the winter of 1941-1942, propaganda films were widely shown in Ukraine's major industrial centers: Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipropetrovsk. Over 24 such films, targeting various professions, were produced. Thanks to this propaganda, the first train of Ostarbeiters from Kharkiv to Cologne consisted entirely of volunteers. This continued until the spring of 1942, but thereafter, deportations became forced. Ukrainian women often worked as domestic servants in German families, while men worked as builders, metallurgists, miners, or railway workers. The largest number of Ostarbeiters were employed in agricultural work and weapons manufacturing. The total number of Ostarbeiters from Ukraine ranged from 2 to 3 million. When a country is successively occupied by two totalitarian states, collaboration with one enemy against the other is difficult to judge unequivocally. Ukrainians did participate in German military formations, such as the Nachtigall and Roland legions, and the 14th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division Galicia. The first two were foreign battalions of the Wehrmacht, created at the beginning of 1941 and lasting until October of that year. They were mostly composed of Ukrainians, many of whom later joined the Ukrainian insurgent army. In particular, the commander of Nachtigall was Roman Shukevich, the future commander-in-chief of the UPA. The Galicia Division was created in 1943 and operated until 1945. During recruitment, the Nazis effectively used propaganda, calling it the Galician Rifle Division SS, where SS was interpreted as Sich riflemen. At the end of the war, some of the division's soldiers joined the UPA, while others surrendered to the Western Allies. In the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, the Germans carried out mass repressions, with the victims mostly being Soviet prisoners of war, resistance members, Ukrainian intelligentsia, and, separately, Jews and Roma. Similar to Stalin, the Nazis used hunger as a weapon, diverting all food resources from Ukraine to the German army. This led to famine in the villages, contributing to the depopulation of the region for future colonization. The Galicia district was part of the General Governorate, which the Germans considered part of the Reich, so the treatment of the Ukrainian population here was relatively better. However, this did not extend to Jews, who were massacred on the spot and sent to death camps. The Holocaust was also carried out on other ethnic Ukrainian lands, including the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. Its victims totaled between 850,000 and 1.6 million Ukrainian Jews. The symbol of the tragedy became Babyn Yar in Kyiv. At the end of September 1941, the first mass killings took place there. About 33,000 people, mostly Jews, as well as Roma and Soviet prisoners of war, were killed. The total number of those murdered at Babyn Yar ranges from 100,000 to 150,000 people. Some Ukrainians, despite enormous risks, helped Jews hide from persecution. Over 2,500 Ukrainians were officially recognized as righteous among the nations for saving Jews. The first settlements in Ukraine in the eastern Donbass were liberated from the Nazis in December 1942. After the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army launched a major offensive, liberating, among others, Kharkiv. Over a year later, Soviet troops reached the current border of Ukraine. Communist rule returned. During German rule, the concept of colonization, harsh and straightforward, prevailed. Indeed, it was far more aligned with the essence of Nazi ideology. Moreover, it allowed for the quickest possible extraction of resources from Ukraine: food, raw materials, and workers.